Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Dark History of Penn's Wood, Murder, Madness, and Misadventure in Southeastern Pennsylvania by Jennifer L. Green. Okay, so I got this book because the author came on one of my tours, and she was just a really sweet, nice person, and her husband was really cute about trying to advertise her book for her. Like, he brought it up like 3 or 4 times, and I was at a time that I had a little bit of extra money in the bank, and I was like, you know, I'm gonna buy this woman's book, and maybe I'll review it, and maybe I'll be able to get her more sales, and it will be really nice. And then it sat on my TBR forever. I really like history, but I rarely read history books, and this seems like a really specific, narrow field of history. It sounded a bit like the kind of book that you pick up when you're visiting the area and you just need something to read in the hotel or on the plane or something, and I'm really sad I put this book off for so long. It's surprisingly great. So yeah, this is a really specific history book. It's about random spooky macabre shit that happened in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's a bit like a ghost tour of the region, but far more in depth and with no actual ghosts. We get some info about witches and witch trials, a couple of murders, a story of a famous highwayman, a story about an unusual burial and reinterment, a natural disaster, and a case of spontaneous human combustion. This is not one of those books that has a deep emotional through line or anything. You can read each chapter by itself with no problems whatsoever. And the author uses the specific stories to talk about broader historical topics, from American history to just random weird history. And overall, I really enjoyed this book. Some of the stories themselves, like if you were to take them in isolation and just tell them as stories, would be a bit underwhelming. A couple of them are just like, you know, a random murder. And like a couple of the murders in particular, there just wasn't quite enough historical information to paint a really entrancing and emotive story. But those stories that lacked a little bit of substance, those were the stories that she used the most as jumping off points to talk about broader historical topics. And so even if the story itself is a little bit weak, you still get a really fascinating chapter about random historical stuff. And I do like the fact that the author didn't just say, like, screw it and make up details to make those stories more dramatic. I feel like that's something that happens a lot in this style of book, that they care more about folklore and legend and telling a good story than they do about the history. And it's very clear to me that this author cares a lot more about being historically accurate than, you know, selling a buttload of books. And I really like the way it focused on painting the picture of the world in which these stories take place, rather than trying to paint the stories themselves as something significantly more complex than they actually are. And I really appreciate the fact that this focuses a lot more on telling us what is normal for the time and comparing it to what is normal now and things like that. Like specifically, the story about the burial and the reinterment, we do spend a good bit of time learning about the guy that gets buried. We learn his basically entire life story, and it's fine, it's interesting, it's whatever. He's an American hero, who cares? But we also get to see why his burial and reinterment happened, and we get to see a lot more. Like, almost half the chapter is just about how transporting bodies worked, and how bodies were treated in the 15, 16, 17, and even in the 1800s. And the author is really drawing attention to the fact that what seems odd to a modern reader would have seemed perfectly normal in the 1800s. And this is just a much more interesting way of tackling these historical stories than I feel often is used. And it made it something that people all over the world would actually be interested in, rather than being something that only people in southeastern Pennsylvania would care about. I do also want to say that one of the reasons that I don't read much history is it's just not a relaxing reading experience for me. I find myself constantly evaluating, constantly judging, constantly looking at the quotes and the stats and the data, and trying to decide if I agree with the author, if I think their bias is showing, if I think they've misinterpreted anything. And I do think it's a good thing to do that. It is very important for history to be right. And history can be very biased because history is so much in the interpretation. Like, you can show 5 different people a collection of data and they will have 5 different interpretations. And sometimes that interpretation is frankly wrong. And in nonfiction, I think it really does matter that you pay attention and you try to decide, does the author actually have a leg to stand on or not? And so for me, reading history is just a lot more demanding and a lot less, enveloping into a story and more constant work. And that's why for me, reading history often does feel like homework. And I just didn't find that much in this book to make me go, I'm seeing your bias. Like, I think the author did a really good job of trying to look at things from multiple sides. And like, yeah, there definitely are biases because everyone is biased. And I feel like there is an intense focus on US history from an American point of view that it's noticeable, but I think the author still did a great job of stepping back and saying, like, hey, this was great for the US. It was terrible for these other groups. And like looking at how the US history impacted world history and how it was impacted by world history. And there was one place I feel like this fell down ever so slightly, and that's the story of Elizabeth Wilson. The chapter starts with an introduction to the idea that people have interpreted her story as a tragedy and the woman herself as a victim, and that may not be true. Specifically, we start with the author introducing us to a historian who has recently written a paper refuting the idea that Elizabeth Wilson was a victim and basically saying that, yeah, no, she is guilty. And then we don't really get what evidence there is that she was so obviously guilty. Like, we get a really cool bit where the author dissects why people in different eras have interpreted the history and the, actual data differently, but we never get that solid, and this is why modern historians think that those previous storytellers were wrong. And for me, it ended up feeling more like the actual answer was it's one of those we'll never really know kind of moments, and not one of those moments that's like, oh yeah, she was guilty as fuck. Whereas the beginning of the chapter made it sound like that's what was going to happen. And so it was just a slight misstep for me. And one other thing that I was really worried about when I was picking up this book is I have little to no connection to the specific region this book is about. Like, yeah, I lived in Southeastern Pennsylvania when I was a toddler. I think it was Southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm not even entirely sure. I lived in Pennsylvania when I was a toddler, but I have no memories of it, obviously. And I was a bit nervous that this book would be littered with the kind of information that you really only care about if you are physically in the location, or full of the references that would make perfect sense if I lived in the area and had grown up with, the region-specific folklore and history, but to someone outside of Southeastern Pennsylvania, it'd be like, why the hell do I care and what the hell is going on? But mostly, this book very much avoided that pitfall. There were sections with the Highwaymen chapter that it just felt a little bit like the author expected me to have a deeper cultural understanding of the characters involved than I do. But largely, no, the author did a great job of giving us plenty of background, giving us the historical basis that we needed, connecting it to the wider world, and never assuming that we know the region or have deep personal connections to specific places or bits of folklore or anything. And I just found this as readable, having not been to Pennsylvania since I was a toddler, as I suspect someone living in the area would. I think she wrote a book that is actually very easily read by people who are not in the region. It's also just fucking funny. The author knew the exact right moments to say something irreverent or to drop a joke. There is a great moment when she's talking about the witch trials, specifically in England, which is, a hard, heavy topic, and we get this line. Since witches were evidently uninterested in overthrowing the government, they managed to avoid much persecution during the reign of the Virgin Queen. And that is just exactly my kind of humor. I laughed out loud. It was so perfect. And it is a lot of that really soft tonal humor that if you're not paying too much attention, you might not notice it. But it was wonderful and witty, and I loved it. The book is also just really readable. It was quick, easy reading, and her arguments are honestly very well founded. I will say I know a good bit about spontaneous human combustion, because I'm that weirdo. I read a butt ton about it when I was a kid, and so I did feel like she left a few things out in that section, but that was just one small chapter in a relatively small book. Like, she didn't really have time to go into the complex, in-depth theories. Like, I think she did a great job for the space that she had. And so I ain't mad about that. Overall, I think this is a fun little book, and it had some really fascinating history in it. It is a bit random, the only through line being the Southeastern Louisiana connection and weirdness, but I feel like that's part of what made it so fun, that it does feel like popcorn reading, just random bits here and here and here, and there was never too much on one topic, so I never got bored. It's a quick read, which I will admit is the reason I picked it up when I picked it up, because I am trying desperately to get ahead of my schedule here, because I have some monstrously chunky books on my TBR, and I would like to read them, and I'm not going to be able to get them done in a week, so I'm trying to get ahead of myself so I can read some of them. But it was fun. It was definitely worth reading. This is a book I can recommend whether you live in Pennsylvania, have visited recently, or have never been there. It's just a fun history book.